In late spring, when it became clear that Indiana's budget surplus would trigger Indiana's automatic tax refund law for the second time this year, Governor Holcomb called for a special summer session to determine how to distribute the estimated $6 billion budget surplus. On June 24th, the Supreme Court ruled against Roe v. Wade and sent the issue back to the states. Now, this meant that the Indiana General Assembly could also address the issue of abortion during their special session in July. We'll explain what measures were passed during the special session that ran from July 25th through August 5th. That's next on WNIN Newsmakers. After 2 weeks of debate in both houses, on Friday, August 5th, Senate Bill 1 was passed and almost immediately signed by Governor Holcomb. Here to clarify and explain what was included in that final bill and everything else that was passed this special session is Representative Ryan Hatfield from Indiana House District 77. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
We also do want to explain that other legislators were invited to discuss the special session, but were unable to participate for a variety of reasons. Well, we aren't here to debate the merits of Senate Bill 1, but we are here to clarify what went into that law and when it goes into effect. So when does that go into effect?
It goes into effect in September, so I believe it's September 1 of this year.
All right. Now, earlier this week, a lawsuit was filed by the ACLU and Planned Parenthood to prevent Senate Bill 1 from actually becoming effective. So tell us a little bit about that process. What are the implications for that, and how long might that take?
Well, it could take quite a while, but the ACLU, on behalf of Planned Parenthood, filed a lawsuit in Monroe County, as you mentioned, based on equal protections. And so as citizens of this country and as Hoosiers, we have a right to equal protections under the law. And the lawsuit specifies that they believe that this violates those equal protections that have been recognized by courts both in this state and throughout the country for a long time. Because the Supreme Court ruled in Dobbs. I believe the lawsuit was filed on a state level, so it'll be handled here in Indiana by Indiana judges starting in Monroe County. Whether or not it has a stay that would prevent the law from going into effect is yet to be known. That has not been ruled on, but I would expect the ACLU to ask for a stay, and we will probably very soon get a ruling on a potential stay. However, the final verdict on that case is probably months, if not more likely years off.
So a very long process. What goes into a process like that whenever you have a challenge to a law like this?
Sure, and you know, laws like this are challenged all the time on state and federal levels, and the ACLU has filed this lawsuit on the equal protections, as I mentioned, and so the parties will have an opportunity to have their day in court, and the ACLU will have to prove to the court that this law does in fact violate people's equal protections under the law, as it's been ruled on by the Supreme Court in the state for decades. And I would anticipate that whatever the ruling is in Monroe County, that we'll see an appeal, which will prevent a final decision or opinion on that case even further. But I anticipate that the Monroe County case will take quite a while.
So it could be a very long process. Well, of course, this bill went through many different amendments and many different changes. So let's clarify exactly what was passed, what was included in the final bill that was passed by the General Assembly and then signed by Governor Holcomb.
Sure. You know, we started with a lot of ideas and a couple of different bills that handled abortion differently in the state of Indiana. The final product, though, was a near ban on abortion and medical services for women seeking an abortion in the state of Indiana. I say a near ban because there are a couple of very narrow, tailored exceptions. In the state of Indiana, after September 1, you will only have the ability to seek an abortion if the pregnancy is a result of rape or incest. However, a big caveat there is you only have the ability to seek an abortion through rape or incest for up to 10 weeks. After the 10-week mark, you no longer have those exceptions available to you. There's only one other narrow exception, which is the life of the mother. And the language really is fairly interesting. So I anticipate that any abortion that happens be due to the life of the mother will be subject to lawsuit. And we'll talk about that in a minute, I think, about what that means for doctors. But for the women of the state, what it means is that they had an opportunity to make their own healthcare decision up to 22 weeks until September 1, 2022. And after September 1, 2022, that right was taken away from them. And there are only very narrow exceptions: rape, incest, life of the mother, and two different standards there: up to 10 weeks for rape and incest, up to 20 weeks for life of the mother. House Democrats argued that it was really not workable. Most women find out they're pregnant sometime between 8 and 10 weeks. In many, many cases in the state of Indiana, even the victim of rape or incest will find out with only 4 or 5 days left before the statute would not allow them to seek an abortion. And so we really, the bill, in my opinion, really prevents most abortions in Indiana and makes it harder and harder for victims of rape and incest to get an abortion because of the time limitation.
Now, how do you determine exactly that someone would qualify for an exemption with rape or incest? Does there have to be a certain process that female has to go through in order to qualify for that? Do they have to fill out a police report? Do they have to present to a medical facility? How do you determine that they've met that exception?
They have to sign an affidavit, which is potentially punishable if someone wanted to challenge that affidavit. One of the concerns that House Democrats had is that Right to Life and other anti-abortion entities will start challenging every affidavit filed and re-victimizing victims of rape and incest. And so they have to file an affidavit swearing that they were the victim of rape and incest. In the case of life of the mother, I think that it opens up doctors to lawsuits because we anticipate that anti-abortion groups will sue on every abortion performed when it was life of the mother, challenging that the mother's life actually wasn't at risk. And so doctors will have to defend against those lawsuits. It's created quite a process or problem in litigation for both women seeking an abortion and for doctors performing them.
So let's expand on that a little bit more in terms of the implications for healthcare providers in our state. How do you think this will affect their decision-making ability in making the best decision for females in their reproductive care, and also, providing healthcare within our state and our ability to continue to have healthcare providers in our state that might be concerned about this legislation?
Maternal health is amongst the worst in Indiana of anywhere in the country. Maternal fatality is amongst the worst in Indiana of anywhere in the country. And, I've been in the room for both of my children who were born, and both had minor complications. But I know as a dad and as a husband in that room, you want that doctor focused on mom and baby. And unfortunately, due to this legislation, I believe now that doctors will have to be focused on mom, baby, and potential litigation that's coming for them. And I'll tell you why. Because the bill opens up doctors to not only penalties, financial penalties, it opens them up to being sued and possible license problems for their medical license based on whether they made the right call. Was the mother's life actually at risk? Was the woman actually the victim of rape or incest? And so I would anticipate that we'll see more lawsuits, more problems for doctors, and doctors are concerned on the criminal side. While I know House Republicans would suggest that there were no criminal penalties, what they did was they added an affirmative defense in the criminal process. And so,
what is that?
And so what that means is that they can still be charged with the crime, but they have a defense. Well, what's that mean? That means they can be charged, have to hire an attorney to go through the criminal process and raise that affirmative defense, saying, look, I have a defense here that was put into law. And then it's up either to a judge, a prosecutor, or a jury to determine whether they meet that threshold for the affirmative defense. And so we're hearing from the state medical associations that while there weren't any new criminal statutes added into the bill, it still may open them up to criminal prosecution, certainly opens them up to a whole host of civil liabilities.
Okay. Well, we will move on to other topics that came up in this session. We do again want to remind everyone that other legislators were invited to attend this session to speak about this today, and unfortunately, due to other commitments, they were unable to. So now on to Senate Bill 2. That was Indiana's surplus this year. This is good news. Was so big that taxpayers are receiving 2 separate refunds. They had originally recommended that those refunds be an additional $225 per taxpayer, but now that has the General Assembly settled on $200. Can you tell us what went into that change and why that is?
I'm going to tell you the truth, and it won't make some of my colleagues happy, but the reality is the Senate wanted to send a message to the governor that he wasn't in charge. The Senate did not want to include the automatic tax repair or fund at $225. They wanted it to be less. The governor had called the special session for the $225 refund, and they settled on $200 because it wasn't exactly what he asked for, and that was, I guess, enough of a win for them. That being said, it's, I think, important for Hoosiers to understand that this automatic taxpayer refund is not due to the legislature, and I'll even admit it's not due to any work that I did. In fact, over a decade ago, the legislature in the Mitch Daniels administration put in a provision that requires a refund back to Hoosiers when revenues exceed 12.5% of the budget. It's really bittersweet, and I agree with you. It's wonderful for Hoosiers to receive refunds. I happen to receive mine. I know there are a lot of Hoosiers waiting on theirs. Mm-hmm. In fact, some Hoosiers are waiting for the first round of $125. So you should be getting $325 per individual. And the second round of $200 even opens it up to people who don't file tax returns. But the reason I say it's bittersweet is because Hoosiers are good, hardworking people, but their state government is rich. And we're rich because we haven't invested in our people. We haven't invested in the programs of Indiana. So why are our revenues exceeding our budget? Because we've cut our budget to a point where our services can't be had. What happened during the COVID pandemic? We saw an unemployment system overwhelmed, a state that couldn't handle the unemployment claims, and people who were waiting for months on their unemployment checks that they were rightfully entitled to. Why? Because we haven't invested in government and in the process that in our roads and infrastructure. We haven't invested in new businesses the way that we should, and so our revenues are high. Because of the Mitch Daniels administration and the work of House Democrats and House Republicans over a decade ago, people were entitled to that refund.
All right, so moving on to other ways that people were getting tax credits beyond refunds. Now they've enacted, I guess, a gas cap or a gas tax cap. Can you explain that a little bit more and what that entails? Yeah,
and it's a really complicated mechanism that they used. There were several different ways to do it, but essentially when gas hits a certain price, we relieve the tax burden on the payer when you go to purchase your gas. And so at a certain level until June of 2023, so kind of now just for the next little under a year, if gas exceeds, I think it's around $3.66, then the tax falls off of that per gallon price.
Okay, so we won't necessarily see a reduction in price due to these tax changes. It's only if it hits a certain price that that benefit kicks in.
That's right, and because of what the president has done at the national level and releasing barrels of oil and in negotiating with OPEC, we expected gas to come down. They still expect gas to come down. When you look at the price of oil, it's well under what it was a year ago, and so we anticipate that it probably won't be into effect all that long because we expect gas prices to come down. However, if before June of 2023 they come back up, the legislature, I think, did a positive thing in relieving people of that tax burden.
Okay. There were other credits that were included in this bill, correct? And one of those included adoption credits. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
That's right. And this is one of a few things we'll talk about that I think we got right. It's too small, in my opinion, but we got it right. In other words, when the legislature said we're going to have this really punitive abortion ban on the one hand, on the other hand, maybe we should fund some of these women and children's services. And so that's what this is a part of. The adoption credits are aimed at encouraging adoption and providing similar credits as folks who have children by birth. Now folks who adopt children will be eligible for similar credits.
Okay. And I guess one question would be, sometimes it's difficult for people to get through the adoption process. It's a long waiting period, but do you feel like this will impact the number of people who are now seeking adoptions because of this new law that's in effect, or credit?
That's exactly right. And the intention, we hope so, and I think it will. I think it's a positive thing. And what we know to be true is we have thousands of children in the state of Indiana who are looking for parents and need adopted. We have thousands of couples who want to adopt. We probably need to streamline the adoption process and make it a little easier on parents who want to adopt, but this credit will certainly go a long way, I think.
Well, an additional tax for parents, a diaper tax has been changed. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Big win. So House Democrats for years have been calling on the suspension of diaper tax along with feminine products. House Republicans agreed with us in this bill and suspended the diaper taxes on diapers. And I think it's a positive thing. These are necessary items in order to care for a baby. And it is just one more way to help Hoosier families cut the cost of having a child.
When do these tax credits go into effect?
Some of them take effect at the end of this year. Some of them will take effect January 1, and then some of them take effect after the budget's passed next year.
Okay.
And so depending on which program we're talking about, they roll out kind of from about September 1 going forward through the end of next year.
Okay. Of course, we talked about that very large budget surplus, and $75 million of that surplus was now earmarked for a variety of social programs. And the biggest chunk of that was earmarked for a newly created Hoosier Families First type of fund. So help us understand what this fund is, why it was created, and how it's going to be administered and by whom.
I think that it's important that our viewers understand that we have a $6 billion surplus, and we put $75 million into social programs. It's a positive step, no doubt, but we could have done a lot better. But let's talk about the Hoosier Family First program. It will incentivize it. First of all, it is administered by the budget agency. There are other agencies involved, the Indiana Department of Health, FSSA, which is Family Services and Social Services, and those funds will be used to administer programs throughout the state to help women and children in the early years. And they can be wide-ranging, and they are still developing. It's a positive thing, but I'd like to see that $75 million go much, much higher. Again, we're sitting on a $6 billion surplus. I think it's important we continue to invest. This is a small but very positive investment.
And I guess I'm also curious how that $75 million will then be funneled into our local communities, and how that will be distributed, and how what is the criteria for being able to access those funds, and how much do you feel like that will impact our local area and our local community?
I think there's no doubt that it will, and that the program is set up for grants essentially, and so programming happens most often at the local level. We have some really wonderful programs in Evansville that care for women and children in need, and they, in many of them, will be eligible for these grant programs. Again, they still have to be set up, and they're spread out through a few agencies, budget agency, FSSA, Indiana Department of Health. There may be another one or two agencies involved, but it's set up as a grant program for already existing programs to apply for funds and get additional help for their services.
Okay. Now, part of this $75 million was the Nurse Family Partnership Program. They're receiving $10 million. Can you give us some insight into what that program is?
This program is awesome, and so I've got some knowledge about this. My wife has had connections to this program in one way or another. Essentially, the Nurse Family program will enable nurses to help families in those early stages of childcare and go into the home in some cases, make sure that things are appropriate, help with car seats, make sure that the formulas are right if they're not breastfeeding, and provide a whole array of services, really wraparound services that women and children need after they leave the hospital. Families who have been through childbirth and hospital, those first couple of days in the hospital aren't your hardest days. It's when you get home, and the Nurse Family Partnership will help those days once you get home.
All right, well, child care is a big thing in the state of Indiana, and there's $10 million earmarked for child care vouchers. So can you explain a little bit more about how that's going to help child care vouchers and how that will help local families?
I've been critical in the past of the voucher system in general, and it's because I think that we should invest in Hoosiers, and Hoosiers shouldn't have to beg for the government, for the money that they sent to the government back. However, we are a voucher-friendly state in a lot of ways, in a lot of different areas, and this is another positive program that will enable families to apply for a voucher to help with child care expenses and predominantly early education expenses.
Okay. $5 million to the Safety PIN or PIN grant fund. Can you explain what that is?
The Safety PIN program is another program that is administered around the state that is aimed at prenatal care for those early days of having a child.
Okay. And lastly, $2 million going to a program called Real Alternatives. Can you explain what Real Alternatives is, and do they serve our local area?
I've been critical of Real Alternatives. Real Alternatives, in my opinion, and we had this debate on the floor, has an agenda. That agenda is an anti-abortion agenda, and to meet women before they've had an abortion, but while they're considering an abortion, and on the positive side, to provide some resources around alternatives to abortion. Unfortunately, what we've seen in other states is these Real Alternative programs sometimes are using abusive behaviors when they meet these women in sometimes dire situations. They did receive $2 million. I can only hope that they'll do better by Indiana and help women seek all of the resources that they have in front of them and allow them to make the best decision with their doctors for them.
Crisis pregnancy, I guess, service, and do you know if they have local impact in our area, or are they in other areas of the state only?
Real Alternative serves most of the major areas of the state, and I believe that they do have services in Evansville.
Anything else that you would like for us and our viewers to know about the special session that you'd like to explain a little bit further before we run out of time?
I would just briefly say that Indiana, we brag a lot about our fiscal stability, and it's true. We have a stable government. What the term I used for it earlier was rich, and the truth is, government shouldn't be rich. Government should be investing in its people. And so we're sitting on $6 billion, and a rainy day fund is great, but Mike Pence told us $2 billion was more than enough for a rainy day fund. Now we're at $6 billion. It's time that we invest in these programs. If we could take the bill that we just went through and multiply it and include other programming, I think we could start to turn around the maternal mortality rate in Indiana, which is higher than anywhere else in the country. And to really start to serve our young people through their early years, get them into pre-K. What we know about a child who goes to pre-K is they're more likely to graduate high school, go to college or a trade program, graduate from that program, less likely to go to jail, more likely to own a house, and less likely to file for bankruptcy. So we need to get these children into early education. That's where I hope next session we'll make big investments.
Well, Representative Hatfield, we appreciate all of your time and information. It was unfortunate that others were unable to join us, although we did invite them to discuss this topic, but we appreciate all of your insight into the special session and what exactly was passed. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Well, next week we'll discuss the community needs assessment. Thanks for watching WNIN Newsmakers.